Hey there, weary traveler. Tonight we're heading back, way back, to a time when survival didn't come from smart thermostats or heated blankets, but from grit, hay, goat breath, and sheer stubbornness. We're talking about the quiet resilience of medieval peasants, the unsung heroes of winter who faced freezing nights with mud-packed walls, communal beds, and hearts full of hope. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But somehow they made it. So before we tuck into their frostbitten world, do me a small favor. Like this video if you enjoy quiet stories told softly. Comment where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this cozy little history circle reaches. And subscribe if you'd like more sleepy tales that whisper through time instead of shouting. Now dim the lights. Pull up your warmest blanket. Maybe let a fan hum gently in the background. Take a deep breath. And let's drift together into the smoky, straw-scented world of medieval winter. You've turned down the lamp, tucked your feet under the blanket, and maybe, just maybe, you're imagining you're about to drift off in a quiet medieval village, somewhere between a mud wall and a straw-filled mattress. But before we go further, let's be honest about something. Medieval sleep was not sleep. Not the kind we know anyway. It was survival. A slow battle between your own body heat and the bitter, unwelcome draft sneaking in through every crack in the wall. Every night was a siege. And your only armor? A few layers of itchy wool, a fire that wheezed more than it roared, and the snoring back of someone you loved. Your medieval house wasn't built to impress. It was built to barely exist. Think of it like living inside a particularly unimpressed loaf of bread, softish, lumpy, prone to mold. Most homes were wattle and daub, a phrase that sounds charming until you realize it means sticks tied together with string and smeared in a paste of mud, straw, and animal poop. That's right. You didn't just live with nature. You wore it, breathed it, and scraped it off your breakfast. There were no windows. At best, a hole stuffed with something suspicious and translucent like oiled sheepskin. Your walls didn't really block the wind. They more like held its coat while it whooshed in and rattled your bones. Now, if your house had a hero, it was the hearth. Not a fireplace, mind you. That was a rich person's luxury. This was a hole in the ground or maybe a slightly raised pit. Wood went in, fire came out, and smoke went, well, nowhere helpful. No chimney. Just a swirling, ghostly cloud that slowly smoked the house from floor to rafter. But in a strange twist of fate, this suffocating smoke actually helped keep bugs away and disinfected the air, kind of like a medieval fog machine but with a side of emphysema. And yet, the hearth was everything. It was warmth, light, cooking, storytelling, and pest control in one sputtering, half-alive flame. It was your best friend and most fragile ally. Because if that fire went out during the night, well, you might not wake up. Now here's where the cleverness kicks in. Peasants learned to bank the fire, which doesn't mean storing it in a vault with a savings plan. It means gently burying the glowing embers under a mound of ash right before bed, like tucking in your fire child for a nap. The ash smothered the flames but kept the heat trapped. If done right, you'd wake up in the morning, poke around, add wood, and voila, fire reborn. If done wrong, you woke up freezing, grumpy, and possibly plotting revenge on whoever forgot their shift. Because yes, tending the fire was a group effort. Shifts were taken. Kids, grandparents, sleepy teens, they all did their part. Someone was always half awake, poking the embers with a stick and muttering into the dark like a medieval sleepwalker. Let's talk bedding. Forget soft mattresses and scented sheets. Your bed was a sack. A sack filled with straw, rushes, maybe hay if you were feeling fancy. Over time, this straw flattened, grew moldy, collected bugs, and turned into a kind of sad compost pile. Some people didn't even have a bed frame. Just threw the straw straight on the cold dirt floor and hoped gravity would keep it in place. Now you're thinking, surely blankets helped? Yes, blankets. Or rather, a cloak, maybe an old rug or a bunch of rags sewn together and smelling faintly of goat and old soup. And layering? That was the real strategy. You didn't get undressed for bed. You just added more. You were essentially a fabric onion. A wrinkled, shivering, coughing onion that dreamed of sunlight. But here's the thing. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew the best source of warmth wasn't a wall or even a fire. It was each other. So entire families, and sometimes neighbors, slept in a communal heap. Think of it as human lasagna. Layers of people, livestock, and cloaks, stacked in the warmest corner of the house, sharing heat whether they liked it or not. Infants and elders were placed in the center. Strong adults formed the outer layer, like a warm crust shielding the gooey middle. And yes, sometimes animals joined in. Chickens roost in corners. Pigs lay near the hearth. Cows, warm and sleepy, leaned against walls. It was like Noah's Ark, if Noah had a smaller budget and no concept of hygiene. Privacy wasn't a thing. Not even close. You woke up with someone's foot in your face, a goat breathing on your neck, and the vague memory of your cousin snoring into your ear. Occasionally, a chicken would climb onto someone's head. A pig might roll over in the middle of the night. If you were lucky, you were in the middle of the pile. If unlucky, you were on the edge, next to a drafty wall and a judgmental cow. And it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was noisy. Snoring, grunting, animal noises, and the ever-present danger of someone getting up to check the fire and stepping on your arm. And here's a fun fact, even breathing was strategic. Taking a big mouthful of icy air could lead to coughing fits, chest infections, or worse. So peasants learned to breathe slowly, shallowly, and through the nose. Kids were scolded for panting indoors. Some even tied a rag or cloak over their face to warm the air before it entered their lungs. It wasn't comfortable. You'd wake up with a soggy, slightly frozen patch of wool stuck to your mouth. But hey, it beat pneumonia. Another trick? Going to bed full. Big meals meant warmth. Your stomach worked overnight, creating internal heat. So peasants ate heavy stews before bed, turnips, onions, barley porridge, hunks of salted pork. Not gourmet but enough to keep the cold at bay. You might dream of flying turnips and angry cabbages, but at least your toes wouldn't fall off. And then there were gadgets. Okay, not gadgets in the modern sense but medieval hacks. One was the hay box. A wooden crate lined with hay used to keep food warm longer. But it also worked to keep heated rocks warm. That's right. Someone, usually the youngest child, would heat a stone in the fire, wrap it in cloth, and tuck it at the foot of the bed. A kind of prehistoric heating pad. Get it wrong and you burned your foot. Get it right and you had 5 hours of blessed warmth. Still, despite all this cleverness, some winters won. Entire families didn't make it. Villages froze. Fires died. Roofs collapsed. And spring brought with it stories of those who had not survived the long night. But that's why every surviving morning was sacred. Every ember that still glowed by dawn was a little victory. Every breath in the cold was a stubborn declaration. I'm still here. And as you lie in your modern bed, soft sheets, warm air, silence all around, you can be grateful for the unknown peasants who huddled together and fought through 1,000 winters just to carry us here. They may not have had warmth, but they had fire. And they had each other. There's something strangely comforting about the thought of survival stripped down to its most basic form. No gadgets. No apps. No distractions. Just warmth or the lack of it. In the dark heart of medieval winter, that was all that mattered. Each night was a quiet negotiation with nature. And peasants, for all their simplicity, had an impressive ability to bargain for one more morning. It often began with the sound of a fire sputtering. Not crackling like you'd want it to. Just a tired little sigh from the coals, barely enough to toast a toe. That was the signal. Someone would groan, shuffle through layers of itchy wool and damp straw, and poke at the hearth with a stick that doubled as a poker and a walking aid. A few sparks would leap out like sleepy fireflies. With a practiced hand, they'd add a scrap of wood, maybe a lump of peat, maybe just whisper a small curse under their breath and hope the smoke would listen. In the far corner you could hear a pig snoring. Loud, deep, and oddly human. Nearby, someone muttered in their sleep, shifted their weight, and knocked a goat off balance. The goat didn't seem to mind. It just curled closer and released a little puff of steam into the freezing air, like a sigh from a woolly teapot. This was the rhythm of a peasant's night. A kind of choreographed chaos under the soft hum of winter wind. Everyone breathing slow. Everyone half asleep. Everyone trying desperately not to move too much. Because every shift meant a fresh gust of cold sneaking into your clothes, sliding across your skin like an icy finger. Every movement was a gamble. Was it worth adjusting that straw poking your hip if it meant waking the baby or dislodging the corner of the blanket currently keeping your sister's nose from freezing? And blankets, well, calling them that is generous. They were more like patched-together memories of better fabric, stiff with time, smoke, and the occasional stain no one asked about. Yet still they were clutched like treasure. Sometimes entire families shared a single woolen mass, each person tucking their feet in like it was the last chance they'd ever get to feel them. Children were wrapped tightly, turned into soft little sausages of wool and linen. Not for comfort but efficiency. A well-wrapped child was less likely to wake up wailing because their ears froze. And if they did, it meant someone had to get up again to adjust things. Parents learned quickly, better to overwrap than underplan. Even if the kids waddled like bundled root vegetables. And above it all, hanging in the thick air, was the smell. Not of anything in particular. More like everything at once. Sweat, dirt, hay, smoke, goat breath, and just a trace of burned stew from dinner. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. The scent of shared survival. No one noticed it anymore, not really. You didn't complain about smells when your eyelashes were at risk of freezing shut. Some nights, the cold was so bad that people didn't even sleep fully. They drifted. Hovered in that weird place between dreaming and freezing. Tossing and turning wasn't for comfort, it was for circulation. You moved to avoid letting any part of your body go numb. And if someone accidentally uncovered your foot, there were no words. Only the slow, angry process of reclaiming a scrap of cloth and retucking your way back into tolerable misery. But there were moments of quiet magic too. Someone would murmur a story, soft and sleepy, about a creature in the woods or a saint who walked through snow and never got cold. Someone else might hum. Not a song really, just a low vibration. Something to fill the dark and keep the silence from feeling so loud. And if the fire caught properly, if the embers glowed and the wind stayed away for a while, you could almost imagine you were safe. That the worst had passed. That the morning might come without frost on your eyebrows. In the rare case you had a heated stone, you were royalty. A rock, pulled from the fire, wrapped in cloth, and placed under the hay near your feet. It radiated heat like a tiny sun, and for a brief moment, you remembered what luxury might feel like. Until it cooled. Or burned a hole in your sock. Or got stolen by a dog. Because yes, dogs lived inside too. Not because peasants loved pets, though some did, but because dogs, like cows and chickens, had body heat. And body heat was currency. The more living things you could pack into your home, the better. The house became a barn. A barn became a furnace. And your bed became a strange kingdom ruled by whichever creature snored the loudest. Sometimes, when the wind howled particularly hard, someone would get up just to press more rags into the walls. Stuffing cracks. Slapping on wet dung like paint. Whispering half prayers to saints who probably had better things to do. But still the work was done. Because winter wasn't kind. And it didn't forgive laziness. Meals were planned around the cold too. If there was extra stew, it was saved and stored carefully in hay to keep it warm. Maybe it was eaten as a midnight snack. Maybe not. But knowing it was there brought comfort. Like a promise that not everything would be cold forever. And through all of this, the fear lingered. Quiet, polite, but always there. The fear of waking up to silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence where the fire's gone out. Where the goat isn't breathing. Where someone hasn't stirred for hours. Those were the moments that stole the breath from your chest before the cold could. Moments where even the strongest among them felt helpless. But most nights weren't like that. Most nights ended with the slow gray light of dawn sneaking in through that pathetic window hole. Someone would grunt and stretch. The pig would snort. A child would sit up and complain. And someone else, still wrapped in a dozen layers, would declare, half proud and half shocked, "We made it." And that was it. No applause. No celebration. Just the slow shuffle toward the hearth, the gathering of kindling, the rekindling of the fire. Another battle survived. Another night endured. And another day waiting as the wind rattled the walls again for the next. Because winter wasn't a season. It was a series of small, stubborn victories. One not with comfort or ease, but with hay, breath, and the warmth of other people. And so they carried on, dirty, exhausted, layered like onions and just as fragrant, fighting back the dark one ember at a time. Somehow, through all the discomfort and drafts, peasants didn't just survive alone. They survived together. Winter wasn't a solo mission. It was a group project. A muddy, noisy, smoke-filled collaboration where no one really had enough, but everyone still gave a little anyway. If the fire in your neighbor's house went out, you noticed? Not because you were nosy, well, maybe a little nosy, but because a home without smoke curling from the roof was a bad sign. It meant the fire had died, and in medieval terms, that meant someone inside might be dying too. No one needed a formal alarm. No official town crier. Just sharp-eyed grandmothers or restless kids who noticed what others didn't. Old Tom's chimney looks quiet, someone might whisper. And suddenly a chain of motion began. Someone grabbed a hot coal wrapped in cloth, someone else bundled up and headed into the wind, knocking on a frozen door, not waiting for an answer. And if no one opened up, they went in. Because in that world, no one deserved to freeze alone. Inside, they'd find Tom curled up under a blanket that used to be a curtain. His fingers stiff, his breath barely a mist in the air. And they'd shake him, warm him, feed him a bit of whatever stew they could spare. Not because they had plenty. Because they had some. Sometimes they didn't even bring fire, they brought space. A small family of 5 would scoot over on their already cramped straw bed and squeeze in Tom and his wheezing dog. No questions. Just a nudge and a come on then. Move your cold feet. It wasn't charity. It was survival math. Because next week it could be your house without fire. Your kid coughing from the cold. Your roof caved in from heavy snow. And you'd want someone to knock on your door too. And that was the village secret. Beneath the goats and the grime and the gut-wrenching cold, there was always a quiet, relentless thread of connection. People didn't just endure for themselves. They endured for each other. Even the youngest children knew this. They delivered messages. Ran barefoot through snow with bundles of firewood. Hugged their siblings tighter when someone cried from the cold. No one was too small. No one was excused. In winter, everyone did their part, or froze. And somehow in that frozen mud pie of a village, warmth lived. Not just in the hearth but in gestures. A shared blanket. An extra ladle of stew. Someone giving you their only pair of dry socks because your toes turned purple. But for all the effort and care, there was still something else peasants clung to, faith. Because once you'd patched every wall, stuffed every crack, banked every fire, and prayed the cow didn't sit on the kindling again, all you really had left was hope. And hope, in medieval times, came wrapped in prayers. Before crawling under those crusty wool blankets, families often knelt beside the hearth and whispered into the smoky dark. Some asked God to keep the fire alive. Others prayed to St. Nicholas, not for toys but to protect their roof from caving in. Some said prayers for the sick or old. Others just asked for one more sunrise. Not all of it made sense. Not all of it was logical. But in the dead of night, when the wind wailed like it knew your name, logic wasn't much comfort. Belief was. Some peasants marked doorways with chalk after feast days, hoping to ward off spirits, or maybe just the cold. Others sprinkled a drop of holy water near the hearth, not really sure if it worked but not willing to risk it. Candles, blessed by priests or grandmothers, which were sometimes the same thing, burned low into the night. Not for light. For reassurance. Because sometimes, a single flickering flame felt like it could keep the world together. Of course, faith wasn't always quiet and neat. Sometimes it was desperate. Please Lord, if you keep this roof up through the night, I swear I'll stop cursing at the pig. Or, let us all wake up tomorrow and I'll give Ethel back her cooking pot. Probably. These weren't polished prayers. They were raw. Honest. Full of bargaining and bad theology. But they were real. And maybe that's what kept them going. Not certainty but stubbornness. The kind that says, I don't know if this will work but I'm going to keep trying anyway. Because not every night had a happy ending. Some winters were cruel. The fire died. The stew ran out. The roof collapsed in the dark. And the morning revealed silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't breathe. Springtime often uncovered what winter had hidden. A house with no footprints in the snow. A chimney with no smoke. A door that wouldn't open. And inside sometimes they found a family curled together. Still locked in an embrace that had tried, desperately, to stay warm just a little longer. That was the price. The risk everyone took. Every night. But even in the worst winters people came back. Someone swept out the old house. Someone buried the dead. Someone gathered the neighbors and shared what food remained. Life moved forward, not easily, not joyfully, but steadily. Because that's what peasants did best. They endured. And it wasn't just enduring for themselves. It was laying something down for the future. A path. A lesson. A kind of quiet legacy written in straw and soot. All the little things that helped them survive, the hay boxes, the patched rags, the community fire sharing, the whispered bedtime prayers, they weren't glamorous. They weren't noble. But they were enough. And every modern luxury we enjoy today, the insulated walls, the double-pane windows, the central heating that hums quietly while we sleep, exists because someone hundreds of years ago wrapped themselves in a moldy blanket, curled up next to a chicken, and refused to freeze. That's their gift to us. Their legacy isn't castles or crowns. It's the knowledge that you don't need comfort to survive. You need creativity. You need stubbornness. And above all, you need each other. And maybe, just maybe, when you wake up warm tomorrow, blanket snug, heater humming, you'll take a second to remember them. The forgotten ones. The smoky, shivering, soot-covered peasants who never gave up. Not when the fire sputtered. Not when the cold howled. Not even when death knocked. Because their story isn't just about the cold. It's about how, in the deepest dark, the smallest ember still matters. And sometimes that's all you need. Just one ember. Just one breath. And the will to keep going. Let's imagine you're standing outside a medieval peasant's house. It's winter. The wind is already muttering rude things as it snakes down the village road, and you can see your breath puffing out in little clouds. You're cold. But don't get your hopes up just yet. Stepping inside doesn't mean you'll be much warmer. The home before you is small. Not charming cottage small, but crouch to enter, don't turn around too fast small. It's the size of a generous modern garden shed, and it looks like it's been through things. The walls are lumpy, patched, and slightly sagging. The roof dips in the middle like it's trying to take a nap. And from somewhere within, there's the faint smell of something burning. Hopefully wood. Possibly not. The walls, if we're being honest, are barely walls. They're made from a method called wattle and daub, which sounds quaint until you realize it means basket we've smeared with muck. Long, thin branches crisscrossed like a giant nest, then smeared with a mixture of mud, straw, and whatever else was handy, including, frequently, animal dung. Cow, horse, pig, whatever was lying around really. Dung had staying power. It was sticky, insulating, and always in stock. Once applied and left to dry, it formed a sort of crust. Not exactly solid. More like determined. It could hold back the weather most of the time, but not all of the time. After a few weeks of rain, it began to slump. After a few months of snow, it cracked. And after a few years of children leaning against it and chickens pecking at the edges, it began to feel less like a house and more like a soft suggestion of one. And then there were the cracks. Because no matter how much mud you packed in, gaps formed. The wind knew where they were. It found them every night. It snuck in around your ankles and blew across your nose while you slept. You'd stuff rags into the holes. Maybe moss. Maybe old socks. And still the breeze whispered, "Nice try." Step inside and you're greeted by the ground. Not a floor. Just ground. Dirt, packed down over time by feet, hooves, spilled stew, and maybe the occasional collapse of a sleeping pig. When it rained, the water came up through the bottom. The ground absorbed it, drank it in, and offered you a soggy reminder that gravity goes both ways. If it snowed, the water didn't need to melt to get in, it just pushed its way up from below, quietly, persistently. Your floor was alive, and not in a poetic way. In a please stop squelching way. There were no tiles. No planks. Maybe, just maybe, someone had laid down rushes, long dry grasses, over the dirt to create the illusion of flooring. At first they looked nice. Smelled nice too if you mixed them with herbs like lavender or rosemary. But after a week or two the rushes were trampled, flattened, soaked, and becoming compost underfoot. They were rarely replaced, only added to. Layers upon layers. Dead plants mingling with old crumbs, bits of bone, and whatever small creatures had decided to take up residence. Your floor wasn't just dirt. It was a multi-species habitat. Look up and the roof doesn't inspire confidence. It's thatched. That is, it's made from bundles of reeds or straw, tied together and layered on top of wooden rafters. It looks rustic in the way a scarecrow might look formal. When it's freshly thatched, it's almost waterproof. Almost. After a few seasons, it begins to sag, letting in drips and drops during the night. Sometimes birds build nests in it. Sometimes squirrels move in. Occasionally something larger, something with paws and a curious nose, finds a cozy hollow to call its own. From inside, you might see movement in the ceiling and hear the occasional plop of something landing in your stew. You get used to it. You fish it out. You carry on. And windows? Well, that's a generous term. If your house had a window, it was likely a small hole in the wall, maybe the size of a dinner plate. No glass. Just a piece of cloth, an animal skin, or a wooden shutter you could pull closed. When the wind blew hard, it blew through the window, not around it. You might tie a bit of oiled parchment over the hole to block the worst of it, but good luck keeping it in place during a storm. It wasn't uncommon to wake up and discover your window covering had vanished during the night, flapping away into the dark like a ghostly sail. The breeze that came in through those openings didn't just chill you. It slapped you, woke you up, rearranged your hair. Sometimes you'd have to sleep with your cloak pulled over your head just to keep the wind from whistling in your ears. Doors weren't much better. They were wooden if you were lucky, maybe just a slab of heavy planks lashed together with leather or rope. Hinges creaked. Latches jammed. In really bad weather, the door might swell and refuse to open, or worse, open far too easily and rattle all night long. Many doors had gaps underneath wide enough to let in not just cold air, but the occasional chicken or curious rat. And yet, in spite of all this house was a home. It held people, stories, dinners, births, arguments, laughter, songs, prayers, and secrets. It was drafty, damp, and vaguely squishy in places, but it was theirs. On the coldest nights, families would pack extra mud onto the outside walls. A second coat of dung and straw, slapped on with red fingers in the freezing dusk, just to buy a little more warmth. It didn't look pretty, but it worked. Sort of. Some even called it a winter skin, as if the house needed to layer up too. The inside walls were sometimes decorated. Not with paintings or portraits, but with practical things. Hooks made of bent twigs, shelves carved into the dirt. Maybe a bundle of herbs hanging from a beam. A bit of dried meat. A family charm. Things hung low so that the wind wouldn't catch them. Anything light enough to blow away was tucked down near the floor. And there were the smells. Earthy. Smoky. Sweaty. Tangy with livestock. A little sour, a little sweet. Every family had their own scent signature, and houses soaked it up like a sponge. If you stepped into a neighbor's home, you knew you weren't in your own just by the way your nose wrinkled. But this smell, this messy architecture, this wheezing, cracking, steaming little shelter, it was the best defense they had against a world that wanted them frozen. They didn't live in castles. They didn't live in clean, dry cottages with flower boxes and welcome mats. They lived in compromises. Structures that stood up not out of brilliance, but out of habit and necessity. If a wall collapsed, they built it again. If the roof caved in, they thatched it again. If the floor turned to mud, they laid down more rushes and kept going. These homes weren't pretty. They weren't built to last forever. But they were built to last just long enough. Just long enough to get through one more winter. Just long enough to keep one more fire burning. Just long enough to remind the wind, not tonight. If the icy wind slipping through the walls wasn't enough, the ground had its own cruel tricks. You might think the floor of your home is where you find stability, someplace solid to stand, rest, or nestle into sleep. But in a medieval peasant's house, the floor was more like a silent traitor. It didn't just lie there beneath your feet. It waited. You see, beneath the straw and the dirt and the scattered rushes, the earth held its own cold. Deep, ancient cold. The kind that crept up slowly like a thief in the night. And once it reached your skin, it didn't let go. You could warm your hands by the fire. You could turn your back to the wind. But the ground was always there, underneath everything. Breathing out frost. There were no wooden floorboards. That was for castles or churches, or people whose walls didn't crumble when a goat leaned too hard against them. For the peasant family, the floor was just the earth, trampled smooth by daily life, spilled on by soup and tears, and occasionally frozen hard enough that you could feel the chill rise through your bones like a whisper from the underworld. In summer it was manageable. Dusty, a little smelly, but
first
not
it worked.
unfriendly. The fresh
winter
rushes
it turned
rustled
savage.
softly beneath your
It
feet.
hardened.
The
Crack.
scent lifted the air.
Sometimes
it even
it almost
shimmered
felt
with a thin
pleasant.
skin of ice,
Almost.
as if
Then
daring you
came
to
the
lie
weeks.
down and sleep
The
on
rushes
it.
got trampled
And if you
flat.
dropped something,
The straw
an onion,
shifted.
a wooden
The
spoon,
floor
your
grew
own
a
crust,
It
an
disappeared
ecosystem
into the
really
permafrost
of
not to be
decomposing
retrieved
plants,
until the
stray
thaw.
crumbs, bits
So
of wool,
peasants
and
not
tiny
being
creatures
fooled
who thought
thought
your
back
house
the
was
only
an
way they
excellent
could.
place to settle
With
down and
layers.
raise a family.
They didn't lay
You
carpet.
didn't clean the rushes.
They laid rushes.
You just threw
long
fresh
grasses
ones on top.
cut
From the edges
Over
of
time,
swamps,
the floor
dried
became
in
a
the
living
sun,
history of
and
foot
spread across
traffic,
the floor
a
like
crunchy,
a prayer.
damp,
Sometimes,
slightly
if they could
squishy
get it,
journal
straw
of
was
everyone
added
who had
for
passed
thickness.
through.
And
yet,
in
in
wealthier
spite
huts,
of all this,
meaning
it
huts
still
with
beat
slightly
sleeping
fewer
directly
holes,
on the dirt.
you might even find
Bedtime
herbs
became a
sprinkled
kind of
among the bedding.
negotiation.
Lavender,
Where would you lie?
rosemary, or
Closest
mint.
to the fire
Not
meant
for
warmth,
cleanliness
but also
exactly, but to
Farthest
confuse the
meant
nose into
freezing, but
forgetting
also
everything
quiet.
else. In the center meant comfort, but only if your uncle didn't snore and the cow didn't fart. But wherever you laid down, the enemy was the same, the ground below. Straw bedding helped. Imagine a rough wooden frame filled not with feathers or fluff, but with hay, dry, scratchy, slightly moldy hay. It poked you. It shifted when you moved. It was sometimes alive with guests. But it lifted you just far enough off the floor that your body had a chance. A little cushion. A little mercy. But hay didn't last. It flattened. It broke down. It went musty. It filled the room with a warm, barn-like scent that lingered even when no animals were around. You could change it, but who had time? And really, what were you going to do with the old hay? Throw it out into the snow? Feed it to a pig that already lived in your kitchen? So people simply lived with it. They layered more straw, more rushes. They accepted the fact that their floor was a compromise between warmth and biology. Children rolled around on it. Couples huddled on it. Grandparents dozed in corners of it. And if someone coughed too hard or shifted in their sleep or reached down to find the edge of a blanket, they'd feel it. The cold, rising up, subtle but unstoppable. Like a ghost no one had invited. To fight it, people got creative. Some added animal skins beneath their sleeping area. Others packed down layers of rags or woven mats. But even then, the cold found cracks. It moved like water. It followed your limbs. If your foot slipped off the bedding during the night, it froze. You'd wake up gasping and fumbling to tuck yourself back in. The phrase cold feet wasn't a joke. It was a diagnosis. And so you learned to move carefully in your sleep. To stay curled. To keep your back pressed to the warmest person near you. To never, ever, let a hand or a foot dangle into open air. Sometimes people used heated stones to fight the floor. Plucked from the hearth with tongs, wrapped in rags, and placed under the hay. For a while it worked. The heat radiated, slow and soft like a miracle. Until it didn't. Until it cooled or cracked or scorched a hole through your only blanket. Still, it was worth the risk. A warm rock was better than a frozen toe. The floor was never your friend. But it wasn't an enemy you could escape. You slept on it. You worked on it. You gave birth on it. You said goodbye to people on it. And in some cases, when winters were cruel and food was gone and fires had long died out, you lay down on it and didn't rise again. Because even the strongest straw couldn't always outlast the cold. And yet, every morning that you did rise, that was a victory. To stand up and stretch, bones creaking, blanket falling away, and feel the light of the pale dawn touch your face through the ragged hole in the wall, that meant something. You'd beaten the floor again. The frost hadn't taken you. Not yet. There was always work to do. The rushes needed freshening. The fire needed feeding. Someone needed to dig out the straw mattress and check if it was time for new stuffing. But for a few minutes there was peace. A kind of unspoken celebration. You were alive. The floor hadn't won. Not today. So you smiled, maybe just a little. Shook out your cloak. Patted the goat that slept too close to your pillow. And stepped barefoot onto a floor that was cold, damp, cracked, and completely yours. Because it was a house. And more importantly, it was home. When you stepped into a medieval peasant's house during winter, assuming the door wasn't frozen shut or being blocked by a sleeping pig, the first thing you noticed wasn't the walls or the floor or even the family huddled like a pile of laundry in the corner. It was the hearth. That small, crackling fire, usually tucked against one wall or right in the center of the room, was everything. The hearth wasn't just the source of heat. It was the kitchen, the light, the TV, the soul of the home. It was a fragile miracle in the middle of a fragile house. And it never stopped working, because if it did, neither would anyone else. There was no grand fireplace with a carved mantel. No chimney sweeping smoke neatly into the sky. Just a shallow pit or a ring of rocks, sometimes no more than a few inches deep, where the fire burned with a kind of quiet stubbornness. It smoked, it sputtered, it sometimes sulked, but it burned. And as long as it burned, so did hope. Smoke, by the way, was its own character in the home. With no chimney, the smoke went wherever it pleased. It drifted up into the thatch. It oozed out through gaps in the roof. Sometimes it just swirled lazily around the room like it was trying to decide whether to exit or settle in for the night. You got used to breathing it. Everyone did. You coughed a little. Your eyes watered. But you didn't complain. Not because it was fun, because that smoke, for all its drama, also chased out fleas, lice, and anything else that didn't belong. You didn't need bug spray when you lived in a slow-burning smokehouse. The hearth didn't just warm your toes. It fumigated your family. There was a certain rhythm to life around the hearth. During the day it cooked your food, dried your boots, warmed your fingers. But at night it became something else, something sacred. It was the last thing you looked at before bed. The thing you checked once, twice, sometimes 3 times just to make sure it was still alive. Because if the fire died overnight, well, that wasn't just inconvenient. That was a problem. There were no matches. No lighters. No handy click-click sparks to bring it back. If the embers went out completely, you were back to flint and steel. And that was an art. You needed dry tinder, patience, and the quiet determination of someone who didn't want to freeze to death in their own living room. That's why most peasants developed the skill of fire banking. Each night, before bed, someone would carefully gather the glowing coals and gently tuck them under a blanket of ash. Not too much ash, it would suffocate them. Not too little, they'd burn out. It was a delicate balance, passed down from generation to generation like a family recipe. How to keep your fire asleep but not dead. In the morning, if you'd done it right, you could poke the ash gently, blow a little breath into it, and coax the fire back to life like an old friend being woken up for another long day. If you did it wrong, the morning would be much colder. Much grumpier. And someone would probably mutter something about whose turn it had been to check the coals. Fire banking was serious business. People had opinions. Some said use only dry ash. Others insisted damp ash trapped the heat better. Some buried the coals deep. Others liked to leave them closer to the surface so they could be roused with a quick stir. You could start a spirited debate just by suggesting someone else's fire banking technique was inefficient. In a world without social media, fire arguments were the original comment section. And keeping the fire alive wasn't a solo task. It took a family. Someone always had to be on ember patrol. That meant shifts. Rotations. Quiet footsteps in the dark. Someone creeping over the sleeping bodies, trying not to step on a child or a goat, leaning in close to the hearth to check. Still warm? Still glowing? Still alive? Children old enough to walk and hold a stick were included. You didn't get a pass because you were 8. If you could stoke, you could poke. Grandparents often stayed up longer by the fire, both because their joints didn't enjoy lying down anymore and because they knew what to do when the flames misbehaved. Everyone had a role. If the fire flickered too low, someone might add a bit of peat or a sliver of wood or a twist of dry grass. If it flared too high and threatened to throw sparks onto the sleeping straw mattress nearby, someone else was ready with a pot of water or a heavy blanket. The fire didn't just need tending. It needed managing. And in the glow of that flickering light, life happened. Stories were told. Gossip whispered. Songs sung in half-hummed verses. Shadows danced on the walls and children fell asleep to the rhythm of the flames. Sometimes, after a long day of freezing winds, muddy chores, and the never-ending battle with damp socks, the hearth was the one warm and steady thing in the world. It didn't judge. It didn't ask questions. It just glowed. Softly. Quietly. Patiently. Pets curled up near it. Livestock edged closer if they were allowed. Humans jockeyed for position like moths. Being closest to the fire was a prize. But it came with risks. Get too close and you might wake up with your cloak smoking. Or your eyebrows singed. or a chicken deciding your warm lap was the best place to roost. The heat from the fire didn't spread evenly. It was directional. It blasted the people directly in front of it, leaving the others in shadow. If you turned just right, you could warm your front, but your back would freeze. People developed a slow rotation. Warm the front, turn, warm the back, repeat. It was like being on a human rotisserie. Still, there were moments of real peace. Moments when the fire burned steady, when the cold held back, and when the soft crackle of wood sounded like the kindest lullaby. You'd close your eyes and listen, not just with your ears but with your heart. Because the hearth was more than fire. It was comfort. It was memory. It was survival. When someone in the house passed away, a piece of wood might be burned in their memory. When a new baby was born, they were cradled near the fire first, as if to introduce them to the warmth of the world. When a guest arrived, rare but treasured, they were given the closest seat to the flames. That was honor. That was hospitality. And when the fire finally truly died, when the coals went cold and the smoke drifted away, it meant something. It meant the house was empty. Or gone. Or mourning. No one lived without fire. If your fire died, your world stopped. And so peasants did everything they could to keep it alive. With ash. With breath. With half-burned twigs and leftover straw. With faith. With memory. With hands that shook in the cold but reached for the poker anyway. The hearth didn't guarantee survival. But without it, survival was impossible. It was a friend. A duty. A lifeline. A glowing ember in the dark, holding back the frost. And for as long as it burned, so did they. At a glance, it might seem strange, shocking even to the modern eye. Entire families bundled together like potatoes in a sack, limbs tangled, snores overlapping, feet in someone's face, and maybe the occasional pig nuzzled under a blanket. But in the medieval world, that kind of closeness wasn't just tolerated. It was necessary. When the outside world turned to ice and wind and brittle silence, the inside world shrank to a single goal: keep the warmth in. Forget privacy. Forget personal space. These were luxuries no one could afford in the cold months. Beds, if you were lucky enough to have one, weren't cozy little rectangles with headboards and quilts. They were more like platforms of straw or sacks of hay, with enough room for as many bodies as could fit. You didn't own your spot. You earned it by arriving on time, not complaining, and promising not to steal the blanket. The rule was simple: if it breathes, it brings heat. So people slept together. Parents, children, grandparents, sometimes neighbors, sometimes travelers, and more often than not, animals. Chickens under the bed. Dogs on the bed. Cats somewhere in the folds of a cloak. A goat with a limp leg curled against someone's back like a living hot water bottle. Every creature had its place. Not out of affection, though sometimes that too, but out of thermal strategy. It was called bundling in some places, but there wasn't always a name for it. It just was. You huddled. You nested. You slept in a clump. The cold didn't just demand it, it designed the sleep schedule. There was no his room or her room. Just the room. One space. Maybe a loft if you were lucky. Maybe a tucked-away nook beside the hearth. The most vulnerable, the babies, the elderly, the sick, were placed at the center where body heat gathered and stayed longest. The strongest slept at the edges, their backs acting like shields. The order of who slept where wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was deeply understood. Like gravity, or smoke, or the way you knew not to leave your boots near the pig's side of the bed. And speaking of pigs, they earned their keep. Not in gold or labor but in warmth. A pig's body temperature runs a bit higher than a human's, and they radiate that heat like a pink, snuffling furnace. They didn't need much space, and if they liked you, or if they were too tired to object, they'd lie beside you and let you share their warmth. Sure they smelled. Sure they grunted. But at 3 a.m. with frost crawling down your walls and the fire whimpering low, you didn't care. The pig stayed. Some families even brought the cow inside. Just one if space allowed. Not into bed, those stories exist, but into the house. The cow stood near the door, creating a sort of furry blockade between the outside world and the family inside. Her breath added moisture to the air, her body added heat, and her slow, soft shifting reminded everyone that they weren't alone. Was it messy? Of course. Was it loud? Absolutely. Was it hygienic? Not even a little. But it was warm. And in the balance between clean and warm, warm always won. Children adapted early. They didn't think it odd to wake up with a chicken pecking their blanket or a dog licking their nose. They knew the drill. Curl into your sibling. Keep your hands under the covers. Don't hog the warmth. Don't kick the cow. Adults adapted too. There was no romantic ideal about bedtime. You were grateful if your blanket was only mildly damp, your straw only mildly moldy, and the person next to you didn't snore like thunder. Sleep came in bursts. You shifted to avoid cramps. You woke when someone else stirred. And you always checked to make sure the baby was warm. If someone coughed too long, a hand reached out in the dark. If someone cried out, voices murmured. The night was full of small gestures. Quiet kindnesses. A tuck of a blanket here, a gentle shuffle closer there. You didn't have to speak. The language of warmth was unspoken. Of course there were awkward moments. Accidental elbows. Feet where feet shouldn't be. A pig sneezing in someone's face. The occasional realization that the lump under the blanket wasn't a sack of potatoes, but your uncle's backside. But you moved on. You learned to sleep lightly, to adjust without complaint, to appreciate the value of shared breath. Breath, in fact, was part of the insulation strategy. A tightly packed bed meant more than body heat, it meant shared air. Warmer, heavier, more humid. Less comfortable, perhaps, but easier on the lungs than the dry, icy drafts that slid in from the window gaps. If you lifted your blanket and let too much cold air in, you were met with groans and shuffles. Cover it back up, someone would mutter. We'll all freeze. You learned fast. And in those coldest, darkest hours of night, something remarkable happened. Closeness became comfort. What began as necessity, squeeze in or shiver, turned into connection. A kind of wordless solidarity. You weren't just sharing a bed. You were sharing survival. You could feel your daughter's slow breathing beside you. Hear your father's quiet snores. Sense the rise and fall of your partner's chest. Smell the familiar scent of your mother's hair mixed with the scent of smoke and hay and stew and sweat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. These were the people you'd spent the day working beside, eating with, arguing with, laughing with. And now, under a blanket patched 20 times over, with your feet wrapped in rags and your shoulder pressed against your brother's, you were all just warm bodies trying to outlast the night. Sometimes someone would whisper a prayer, or a joke, or a complaint that they'd been given the cold corner again. You might hear laughter, or silence, or soft singing. It wasn't uncommon for songs to drift up in the dark. A lullaby, a folk tune, something passed down from grandmothers, something slow and repetitive, something with warmth in the melody. And in those moments when the fire was low, and the wind outside sounded like a hungry wolf pacing the walls, those songs didn't just soothe the children. They reminded everyone that this was a shared fight. That no matter how cold it got, they had each other. Sleep didn't always come easily, but it came eventually. In waves. Someone would drift off, snore, wake, shift, start over. But slowly the room would quiet. The breathing would sink. The bodies would still. And if you listened closely, you could hear it. The heartbeat of the home. Not from one person but from the many. Breathing. Dreaming. Enduring. Together. There were no separate beds. No alarm clocks. No sleep apps. Just hay and warmth, and the understanding that to make it through the night, everyone had to stick together. The morning always came slowly. First a pale light, then a shuffle, then a moan as someone announced it was their turn to stoke the fire. Blankets were clutched tighter. Children groaned. Animals stretched. And one by one they rose, rumpled, sore but alive. It wasn't always pleasant. But it worked. Because when the world outside froze over, they built their shelter not with stone or steel, but with each other. And in the end that was the warmest thing of all. When the wind howled and the roof creaked and the hearth smoked just enough to sting your eyes but not enough to warm your feet, there was one more line of defense between a medieval peasant and winter's grip. Food. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even particularly good. But it was warm and it filled the stomach, and that, more than taste or texture, was the point. Meals in the cold months were less about celebration and more about survival. You didn't cook because you were hungry. You cooked because the fire was still going, and you had a turnip that hadn't rotted yet, and if you didn't boil something soon, the children might start chewing the straw mattress. Most meals began with water in a pot. If you had broth, real broth with flavor and bones and herbs, you were rich. If you had just water and the memory of flavor, that would do too. Into the pot went anything remotely edible. Turnips, onions, leeks, dried peas, bits of barley, a scrap of old meat, maybe even a rind of cheese or a bone someone had gnawed clean weeks ago. This was pottage, the peasant's eternal dish. A stew without rules. A soup without end. It bubbled gently at the hearth, soaking up whatever you had on hand day after day. You didn't finish it. You just added to it. It was a living stew. A hot, wet scrapbook of your pantry's last gasps. Some pottage pots simmered for weeks, evolving with every handful of grain or pinch of salt tossed in. If you were lucky, it deepened in flavor. If you were less lucky, it became suspicious. But still, warmth, calories, and something to chew. That was enough. Peasants became masters of making little things stretch. A sliver of bacon didn't get eaten. It got waved over the pot like a wand, whispered to like a prayer, and then hung back up to dry again. It wasn't flavoring, it was hope. Sometimes they'd rub a bit of lard on a piece of bread, not to make it rich, but to remind themselves of what richness felt like. There was no waste. Ever. Bones were boiled until they gave up everything they had, then crushed and buried or added to more stew. Vegetable peels weren't discarded. They became soup. Even eggshells might be crushed and fed to chickens who kindly turned them back into eggs. Every scrap had a purpose. Every crumb was claimed. And then there were the preserved foods. Winter food was what you had managed to hide from time. Meat, if you had it, was salted or smoked until it resembled something between jerky and old leather. You'd soak it before cooking if you remembered, or gnaw it slowly while telling yourself it was better than nothing. Salted fish made an appearance too, usually smelling like regret and survival. It was nutritious, yes, but required a strong will and an even stronger stomach. Grains were ground into porridge. Barley, rye, oats, boiled into a thick mush that stuck to the ribs in your spoon. It wasn't sweet unless someone had hoarded a bit of honey, and even then it was rationed like gold. More often it was savory or at least neutral, a blank canvas for whatever root or scrap you had on hand. Roots, in fact, were the winter MVPs: turnips, beets, parsnips, carrots. They kept well if stored right, in cellars, in straw, or just buried in cold soil. Some were sweet, some bitter, all dependable. They were roasted, stewed, mashed, and when all else failed, eaten raw with a grimace. Bread was life. It was also hard. In winter, bread wasn't fluffy or fresh. It was dense, chewy. Sometimes cracked your tooth if left too long by the hearth. Flour was precious and often stretched with ground peas, beans, or even bark when the stores got low. The poorest families made black bread, thick and dark with rye or acorn flour, tasting of ash and effort. To soften stale bread, you dunked it in broth, or water if there was no broth. Sometimes it became a kind of primitive bread pudding, soaked and stirred into pottage. Sometimes it just disintegrated and became part of the stew. Either way, it was eaten. And yes, occasionally there were surprises. When your stores ran thin, you got creative. A handful of nettles? Toss them in the pot. Just be sure to cook them long enough not to sting. Mushrooms from the woods? Take your chances. Sometimes they added flavor. Sometimes they added visions. And sometimes they just added a brief funeral. Grubs and insects weren't exactly a delicacy, but if you were hungry and they were available and they weren't moving too fast, well, protein is protein. They were fried or ground or mashed into flour and hidden in cakes. Children were sometimes better at catching them than adults. They had quicker fingers. Fewer opinions. Fermented things made an appearance too. Sauerkraut. Pickled onions. Things you could store in jars and hope wouldn't explode. The sourness was a shock to the palate, but a welcome one. A little zing broke the monotony of boiled root vegetables. And then there were days, bleak days, when all you had was thin gruel. Water with a hint of something that used to be food. On those days, meals were quiet. Spoonfuls measured like treasure. Parents went without to feed children. Elders chewed slowly, not to savor the taste, but to stretch the illusion of fullness. Still they ate together, around the hearth, from a single pot or a few shared bowls. There were no separate servings, no picky eaters, no second helpings unless someone else didn't finish. They talked while they ate. Or they didn't. They sipped slowly, chewed slowly, and tried to ignore the cold pressing in from the corners of the room. On feast days, rare but real, the table or the floor more often brightened. Maybe there was a roast. Maybe a pie with more crust than filling. Maybe cider. Or ale. Or a sweet cake made with dried fruit hoarded since summer. Those were the days of laughter, of loosening belts, of songs rising in smoky air. They were the memories that kept people going when the stew was thin and the woodpile thinner. Children licked their bowls. Adults scraped the bottom of the pot. The dog looked hopeful. And when the meal ended, someone usually sighed, leaned back and said, "That'll hold us for now." Because that was always the calculation. How long would it last? Could you stretch the grain another week? Could you make the salted meat go 2 more days? Could you go without tonight and still manage the chores tomorrow? And the answer most days was yes. Because they had to. They endured. They adapted. They swallowed what they could, shared what they had, and told themselves that spring was coming. Eventually. And somehow through it all, food wasn't just sustenance. It was defiance. Every bowl of hot pottage, every hunk of stale bread soaked soft again, every slurp of sour cabbage stew, it all said the same thing. We are still here. And that, in the middle of winter, was enough. If winter was a thief, it didn't just steal warmth and light, it came for your health too. Slowly at first. A cough here. A sniffle there. Then more. And worse. And longer. Because in the medieval peasant's home, illness wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a roommate. The cold made it harder to stay well and even harder to get better. Everything ached more. Cuts healed slower. Chills turned into fevers. And in a home where warmth was precious and cleanliness was a luxury, a simple sore throat could become a weeks-long trial. A fever could become a prayer. And a cough that started at Christmas might still be shaking your ribs at Easter. But peasants didn't give up easily. They couldn't afford to. When the body failed, the village gathered around it, not with doctors or diagnoses, but with whatever knowledge, herbs, and kindness they could spare. There were no hospitals. No pharmacies. No neatly printed instructions. Instead, there were memories, recipes passed down, whispered from mothers to daughters, and sometimes scribbled in barely legible script on scraps of parchment. There were stories of what worked and what didn't. And, sometimes, hope that what worked once might work again. You didn't go to the doctor. The doctor didn't come to you. You went to the wise woman if there was one nearby. Or to the grandmother who'd lived through 8 winters and claimed to have cured her husband's boils with warm ale and a beet poultice. Or you relied on your own cupboard of dried things and a handful of boiling water. Herbs were your medicine. Some worked. Some didn't. Some probably made things worse. But they were all tried. Willow bark was chewed for pain. It held a hint of what we'd later call aspirin. Mint was steeped in tea for nausea. Honey was spread on wounds, sticky and golden, to fight infection. Garlic was eaten raw or brewed into potions, believed to chase off sickness with its fierce smell and fiercer flavor. If your head ached, you might bind a warm cloth soaked in vinegar to your temples. If your joints swelled, someone might wrap them with mashed cabbage leaves. If you had a fever, they'd cover you in blankets, then take them off, then put them back on, then mutter about humors and hope your sweat was the breaking kind. And if you were truly ill, flat on your back, shaking with chills, your breath shallow and uneven, there would be no dramatic rush to a clinic. There would be a bowl of broth brought carefully to your lips. A hand on your forehead. Someone sitting beside you through the night. Waiting. Watching. Sickness was both personal and communal. It affected everyone in the room. The fire had to burn hotter. Meals had to be simpler. Chores were reshuffled. The house moved a little more slowly. And no matter how tired the others were, someone always got up to check on you. Because one day it might be their turn to lie down. And through it all there was prayer. You didn't pray instead of treating the illness. You prayed while treating it. You prayed as you mashed the herbs. You prayed as you boiled the water. You prayed as you changed the rags on a sweating forehead. Saints had names for every ailment. There were charms for fever, incantations for boils, crosses carved into doorposts to keep the worst spirits away. And then there was rest. Not clean-sheeted, feather-pillowed rest. Just lying down. As much as the floor in your body would allow. Maybe someone would roll a bit of cloth and tuck it under your head. Maybe someone would lend you the softer corner of the mattress. You'd lie still and listen, to the fire, to the coughs of others, to the silence between them. Sleep helped. Or it didn't. But you always hoped the morning would be better. And if you were injured? That was another journey entirely. A cut might be wrapped in linen and doused with vinegar. A sprain might be rubbed with warm oil or packed in mud. A break, if you could afford to stop working, was set as best as possible with splints made from sticks and bound with twine. And then you waited. And endured. Pain was expected. It was part of life. You didn't whimper unless it was unbearable. You didn't complain unless it was serious. You bit down on something, sometimes your tongue, and you kept going. Because if you stopped, the chores didn't. The animals didn't. The cold certainly didn't. But you weren't alone. In these moments, the closeness that sometimes made winter feel crowded became something else. Comfort. If you couldn't rise to reach the fire, someone else did. If you couldn't ladle your soup, someone spooned it for you. They didn't ask. They just did. That was survival. And the little ones? They got sick too. Often. And dangerously. A baby with a cough could be cause for quiet panic. A toddler burning with fever meant hushed whispers in the night and older children being sent to fetch snow for cloths. Every child lost was a wound that never truly healed. But every child who recovered felt like a miracle. You measured recovery in tiny steps. The first time you sat up. The first full bowl of broth. The first laugh after days of silence. The moment you leaned against the wall and said, "I think I can manage the fire today." That was victory. And through all this, there were superstitions. A coin placed under a tongue. A bell rung 3 times over a feverish child. A feather tucked behind the door. Not because they always worked, but because doing something felt better than doing nothing. They knew that death came in winter. Quietly. Slowly. Not always cruelly. Sometimes just softly. Like a frost settling over a field. But they also knew that life came too. In bowls of broth passed from hand to hand. In herbs strung to dry above the hearth. In fingers checking a forehead. In the songs hummed over sleeping sickbeds. In the fire kept burning not for warmth, but for hope. And when someone got well, really well, when they rose from the straw, thin but smiling, voice rough but alive, there was no celebration. Just nods. A shared bowl. Maybe a joke. Maybe not. Life went on. Quietly. Because what mattered wasn't the cheering. What mattered was that they were still here. Still breathing the smoky air. Still walking on the cold floor. Still holding on. Winter was long. But so were they. There's a certain kind of silence that settles over a home in deep winter. It's not empty. It's not dead. It's just patient. Outside, the world might be still. Frozen soil, branches wrapped in frost, fields tucked under snow like sleeping beasts. But inside, life continued. Slower, softer, but no less present. Medieval peasants didn't have leisure time the way we think of it. They didn't have weekends or screen time or days off to catch up on shows. But winter did give them one rare thing: time indoors. Time without planting or harvesting. Time when the world said, wait. And so they waited. But not idly. There was always something to do. Something to mend. Something to make. Wool for one. If there was any from the last shearing, it was brought inside, unspun and tangled, still smelling faintly of sheep in pasture. Women mostly sat with drop spindles or spinning wheels if they had them, fingers twisting and pulling, turning raw fluff into thread. The rhythm of spinning was calming, steady, hypnotic, like stirring a pot or rocking a child. Spin, twist, wind. Repeat. From that thread came cloth, and from cloth came warmth. Tunics, hoods, cloaks. Some were patched. Some were passed down. Some were never quite finished. But each one held hours of quiet work and more than a few pricked fingers. Children helped or tried to. They were tasked with sorting dried beans or carding wool or simply not getting underfoot. Some were handed dull knives and small blocks of wood, encouraged to carve or whittle or make something that looked vaguely like a spoon. Others chased chickens or watched the fire, or just stared into the dancing shadows and imagined grand stories in the smoke. Because stories were everywhere. You didn't need parchment or ink to tell a tale. You just needed a voice. And in a dark, smoky room, with the fire glowing and the wind brushing the walls like a ghost that forgot to knock, there was no better time to listen. Grandmothers told tales of spirits in the forest. Grandfathers told stories of wars they never quite fought in. Parents made up fables about clever foxes and foolish kings. Sometimes the tales were teaching tools, warnings about talking to strangers or wandering off paths. Sometimes they were just for fun. And sometimes, in the long hush of night, they were the only thing standing between the children and fear. Songs too. Not polished or professional but human. Real. A mother's hum while mending. A father's half-sung verse while stirring the pot. Children making up ridiculous rhymes to make their siblings giggle. Songs passed down like heirlooms, their words worn soft with use. There were games. Not with pieces or boards but with hands and voices. Riddles. Clapping chants. Little contests to see who could balance a spoon on their nose the longest. Sometimes they played pretend, becoming animals or heroes or spirits in the smoke. And sometimes, there was just sitting. Not because there was nothing to do, but because it was enough to simply be. To rest sore feet. To feel the fire on one side of your face and the cold creeping in from the other. To watch your breath curl in the air. To hold a warm cup of broth and not speak. Just listen, to the crackle of flame, the shuffle of bodies, the whisper of wind against wood. That was winter's secret gift. Not time for pleasure but time for stillness. Time to pause. Of course, not all moments were quiet. The animals needed tending even if they lived in the same room. Hay had to be gathered, waste shoveled, udders milked. Tools needed sharpening. Harnesses needed mending. Shoes needed patching. Salt needed checking. If snow fell heavy, someone had to go clear it, or check that the roof hadn't caved in again. But between the tasks there were these little pauses. Time to dry out damp boots. Time to check the fire. Time to stroke a child's hair and pull them a little closer. Time to run a thumb along a crack in the wall and think, we'll fix that in spring. Some even used the time to prepare for next winter. Drying herbs over the hearth. Making extra candles. Knitting. Curing hides. Writing if they could write. Planning. They didn't talk about resolutions. But they dreamed quietly. What seeds to plant. What animals to trade. Whether the cow might finally calve this spring. Whether this year's wool would bring a better price. Whether they might have just a little more to eat next time the frost came back. And they remembered. Winters passed. People lost. People born. The year the snow came early. The year it never came at all. The year they danced on New Year's Eve and no one slipped in the mud. The year the neighbor's roof collapsed and everyone helped rebuild. Memories were another kind of warmth. They wrapped around you like old wool or old songs. They whispered, you've been here before. You'll make it again. Because that's what winter was in the end, not just a season but a story. A test. A rhythm. A lull between the harder verses of the year. It didn't always feel gentle. Some days it bit. Some days it dragged. Some days it made your bones ache in places you didn't know existed. But it also made you notice. The glow of coals. The comfort of shared silence. The joy of soup that didn't taste like yesterday's soup. And when it passed, and it always passed, you stepped outside and felt the sun on your face and thought, we did it. We waited. We lasted. Inside those walls, through the coldest nights, they crafted a world. With thread. And laughter. And songs. And stories. And the quiet power of simply staying. Chickens began to lay more regularly. Goats grew restless. Cows lowed louder in the mornings. Even the barn cats seemed livelier, darting between feet, tails flicking like flags of excitement. And with spring came work. Because spring was not a season of rest. It was the end of resting. It was when everything that had waited through the dark months sprang back to life, and demanded attention. The fields, long silent, now needed tilling. Plows were checked, oiled, patched if needed. Oxen yoked and let out. Men and women took to the land again, boots sinking into mud, hands red with cold and effort, eyes squinting into the low sun. Seeds, carefully saved through winter, were brought out like treasure. Barley, oats, rye, measured, divided, blessed with quiet prayers before being pressed into the softened ground. Every kernel a gamble. Every furrow a hope. Children helped where they could. Scaring crows. Carrying baskets. Fetching water. Or just running through puddles, squealing because they could. Because they were outside again. Spring was noisy. Not loud exactly, but after winter's hush, every sound felt brighter. The creak of cartwheels. The squelch of mud underfoot. The soft slap of laundry hung to dry for the first time in months. The clatter of tools. The burst of birdsong from branches just beginning to bud. And inside the homes things changed too. Heavy cloaks were hung near the door instead of piled on beds. Blankets folded away. Windows open longer. Herbs planted in pots near the hearth were carried outside. The hearth fire, once fed all day, was allowed to go cold by afternoon. Meals grew greener. Nettles, once cursed for their sting, were now boiled into soups. Wild garlic. Young dandelion. Sorrel. The first signs of vitamin-rich life to chase away the pale hollowness winter left behind. People smiled more. Joked more. Laughed more freely. Not because life was easy, it wasn't. It never had been. But because spring made them remember what ease could feel like. It wasn't comfort. It was possibility. New things began. Babies born in winter now gurgled in sunlit corners. Chickens hatched chicks. The village priest began talking about Easter. The days stretched longer, and people began to speak about next month with excitement instead of dread. Clothes were mended more carefully, not just for warmth, but for appearance. Someone might even bathe outside, rushed and shivering but triumphant. Hair was trimmed. Shoes cleaned. Tools sharpened not just for use but for pride. And the planning returned. Talk of marriages. Of trading animals. Of trying again in the upper field. Of building that new shed finally before summer. Of going to market in the next town when the roads were less muddy. Because now, finally, you could go. The world was open again. Not wide, but wide enough. The church bells rang brighter. The sky was clearer, even if still gray. Rain came more often, but it felt cleaner now, more alive. Not the freezing sleet of winter, but the kind of rain that softened seeds and filled barrels and made moss on stones bloom electric green. And the joy, the true joy, was in how small it all was. Spring wasn't a parade. It was a whisper. A sigh of relief. A toe dipped in a stream still too cold. A handful of damp soil. A child's muddy smile. It was the first night the fire didn't have to burn until morning. The first time someone said, "It's not that cold." The first evening you sat outside just for a moment to watch the stars and thought, "We made it." Because making it through winter was not taken for granted. Every year someone didn't. A neighbor. A child. An elder who closed their eyes and simply didn't open them again. Spring was not only a beginning, it was a remembering. A nod to those who had stayed. A bow to those who hadn't. People might walk past the churchyard a little slower. Touch the crooked cross over a cousin's grave. Murmur a name into the wind. Not in mourning but in memory. Because survival was not solitary. It was communal. Everyone had helped everyone. And now everyone was waking up again. There was energy in the air. Not buzzing but building. Like the world holding its breath, ready to bloom. And the peasants, muddy and tired and a little less hungry now, breathed with it. They planted not just crops, but hope. They gathered not just food, but stories. They didn't talk about rebirth or resilience. They lived it. In calloused hands. In laughing mouths. In boots that had walked through snow and now squelched through mud with equal determination. And when the first tree burst into bloom, wild cherry or apple, white and pink against the gray sky, someone always said the same thing. Look, it started. As if winter had been a long chapter. And now, finally, the page had turned. They didn't dance in flower crowns. Not yet. That came later. But they did hum while working. They did whistle on the way to the field. They did smile at the sun and feel it smile back. And in their hearts, in the quiet places still thawing from the months of cold, they held one truth. Spring had come again. And so had they. Spring didn't stay gentle for long. As soon as the first shoots appeared and the mud turned from slush to soil, the world began to pull at the peasants with both hands. There were roofs to mend, tools to sharpen, paths to clear. But most of all there were fields to tend, vast hungry fields quiet all winter now whispering, "Come back." And so they returned. Men and women, children old enough to help, even elders leaning on sticks, each one found their place in the season's great awakening. Spring was beautiful, yes, but it was also urgent. The sun was back and with it the race against time. Before the rains came too heavy. Before weeds took over. Before hunger from last year's harvest returned with teeth. The land didn't wait and neither could they. Plows were hauled out of sheds, their wood swollen from months of damp air. Blades were scraped clean, oiled, tested. Oxen, whose main job all winter had been keeping warm and making manure, were yoked again. Slow, heavy, obedient. The groan of wooden wheels and the rhythmic chug of iron through earth became the music of March. It was hard work, bone-deep hard. The kind of labor that left you blistered before noon and silent by sundown. But it was also satisfying in a way only survival work can be. Every furrow turn was a step toward life. Every seed planted, a whispered promise. And the seeds, oh, how carefully they were handled. Barley, rye, oats, flax, peas, beans. Each type measured out with care, never too much in one spot, never too thin in another. You didn't waste seeds. You didn't gamble with them. They were not just food, they were your future. Children ran ahead with baskets. Older kids dropped the seeds, bent double from dawn to dusk. Younger ones followed behind with sticks, patting the soil gently as if tucking the earth in for a long nap. And in between voices rose, songs short and rhythmic, passed down through generations. Not for beauty but for rhythm. To keep the pace. To keep from thinking too much about the ache in your back or the blisters on your hands. Meanwhile, others worked elsewhere. The homes needed attention. Winter had taken its toll, smoke-blackened beams, cracked daub in the walls, sagging thatch. Spring was a season of repair. Men patched roofs with fresh straw. Women swept out months of ash. Windows were scrubbed, benches wiped, floors beaten with brooms. Clothes too were mended. Not just sewn but truly examined. What could last another year? What needed to be unstitched and turned inside out to become something new? Every hem was judged. Every patch was a decision. Shoes were softened in oil, then relaced with twine. Belts were reknotted. Bags rewoven. And if something couldn't be fixed, it was traded. Which meant the market. Peasants didn't go often, but spring brought need. And markets brought people. Villagers from miles around gathering in the square of a larger town, their carts creaking with goods, their minds buzzing with calculations. You might bring eggs, or ale, or a bundle of wool, or last year's tools that no longer worked for you but might for someone else. And you'd return with salt, or a pot, or a spool of thread, or if you were lucky a slab of iron, or a carved comb for your wife, or a ribbon bright and ridiculous, for a daughter who'd never worn anything that wasn't brown. Markets weren't just about buying and selling. They were about news. Who had died? Who had married? What was happening in the next town? Whether there were rumors of war, or sickness, or good harvests in the south. You'd return home with more than goods. You'd return with stories. And with those stories came new resolutions. To finish that shed. To dig a second well. To finally marry that girl from the other hamlet. To take better care of your boots this year. To learn a new prayer. To teach your youngest to spin. Spring brought possibility. But also pressure. Because soon the days would lengthen further. The sun would grow hotter. The weeds would grow faster. And what wasn't done by summer might not get done at all. So there was a buzz to the village now. Not loud, but constant. Smoke curling from chimneys earlier. Tools clanging from sheds more often. Chickens clucking louder. Bread baking daily again, not just to survive but to feed. Meals were still modest. But they were fresh. broth flavored with early greens, bread lighter, less brick-like, cheese finally aged just enough to eat, and eggs, so many eggs. The hens, relieved of winter's silence, laid with almost aggressive enthusiasm. And so, spring became routine again. But a hopeful one. Waking up to sunlight, not darkness. Stepping outside without holding your breath. Stretching your back in the fields instead of curling it by the hearth. The rhythm of life was back. And with it came joy, small and quiet but real. In the smell of turned earth. In the song of a bird returned to its nest. In the laughter of children chasing each other through puddles. In the first barefoot walk across the warm soil. And yes, it was still hard. There were days it rained too much. Days the plow broke. Days someone fell ill again and you feared it was something worse. But there was no longer the weight of winter pressing on your chest. Instead, there was momentum. And in this season of renewal, peasants renewed more than their land. They renewed their hope. They fixed what they could. Forgave what they must. And leaned into the warmth like plants turning toward the sun. Because they knew what was coming. Not just summer. But another winter. It was always there, like a faint shadow in the corner of spring's light. But that was okay. Because now they were ready. They had rebuilt. They had planted. They had remembered what joy felt like. And they had reminded each other what mattered. That no season, no matter how long, could last forever. Not the winter. Not the hunger. Not even the silence. Because life, as peasants knew better than most, always returns. In the thaw. In the seed. In the work. In the song. And when you faced the coldest nights and lived, spring isn't just a season. It's a triumph. Before there were machines, before engines, before metal moved without muscle, there were tools. Simple tools. Handmade tools. Tools that didn't hum or shine or beep, but groaned and scraped and endured. In a medieval peasant's world, a good tool wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. It's easy today to overlook the quiet intimacy between a person and their tools. But for a peasant, each one held weight far beyond its handle. These weren't items. They were companions. In the field. At the hearth. In the shed. They were part of daily ritual, part of the body, almost sacred. You didn't just use a scythe. You knew its curve. Its balance. How it felt in your grip when the wheat was dry or damp. You didn't just swing it, you moved with it. A rhythm built over years of sweat and muscle memory. That scythe might have been your father's. Or your grandfather's. Its handle smoothed by 3 generations of hands. Its blade, worn but still sharp, lovingly whetted each season with a careful stone. Not just because you needed it to work, but because it had always worked. Because it had always been there. And it wasn't alone. In the barn there was the hoe, wooden, chipped, always in the same spot. Next to it, the spade, its blade a little crooked but perfectly suited for the stubborn clay near the east field. The pitchfork with one tine shorter than the rest. The bucket, patched 3 times with iron bands and still leaking just a little from the bottom, but only if you tipped it wrong. Each item had a story. A scar. A name sometimes. They weren't disposable. Something cracked, you fixed it. If it bent, you straightened it, or learned to live with the bend. Because replacing a tool wasn't just expensive. It was personal. You didn't want a new one. You wanted your one. In the home, tools were equally precious. The pot, blackened from decades of hanging over fire. The wooden spoon with a split down the middle, held together by thread and stubbornness. The loom, if you had one, with squeaky pegs and warped threads that caught on everything but still somehow turned wool into warmth. And in smaller homes, tools weren't just stored. They lived with you. The sickle might rest by the doorway. The spinning spindle might be tucked under your pillow. The knife, every household's most guarded possession, hung from a nail above the fire, sharpened more often than it was cleaned. You didn't lose these things. You watched them. When a child borrowed the family blade, someone watched how they held it. When a neighbor asked for your plow blade, you didn't say no, but you followed them outside just to make sure they knew how it worked. Because tools in many ways were more trustworthy than people. They didn't gossip. They didn't steal. They did what they were made to do day after day in cold and heat, rain and wind. And when they broke honestly. Which is why peasants respected them. They talked to them sometimes. Not in grand conversations, but in murmurs. A muttered, "Just a few more turns to the wheelbarrow." A whispered, "Don't split now," to the axe. A grunted, "Thank you," when the pot didn't crack over the open flame. Because these were not things. They were partnerships. Children learned this early. The first time they were handed a knife to whittle wood, or a broom to sweep the hearth, or a mallet to help with fence posts, they were told, not taught, told, that the tool deserved respect. You treat it right, it treats you right. A lesson passed down with more weight than most sermons. And if a tool was passed down, it was an inheritance. Fathers gave their sons belts worn thin but still strong. Mothers gave their daughters shears dulled from 100 wool clippings, polished with love. These weren't gifts, they were legacies. Symbols that you were now trusted. Now responsible. Now part of the line. Some tools were so valued they were never loaned. Not even to family. The axe that split every winter log. The pot that never burned stew. The knife that sharpened the rest. These weren't just helpful. They were sacred. And when one broke, really broke, there was a kind of mourning. Not loud. Not public. But real. A man might bury a broken scythe behind the barn, not out of ritual but out of respect. A woman might keep a cracked pot near the door, using it for herbs, letting it rest where it could still be useful. Because to throw it away felt wrong. As if you were abandoning a friend. And so, barns and sheds across the village filled with almost tools. Broken things kept for parts. Handles with no heads. Blades with no edges. Because someday something might need that piece. And even if it didn't, you couldn't quite let it go. Beyond tools of labor there were tools of care. The ladle your mother used when you were sick. The wool comb that straightened your sister's hair on feast days. The thread and needle that mended every tear, patch after patch until the shirt was more mending than cloth. These weren't tools for making a living. They were tools for making life. And they held as much meaning as any plow or axe. Even religious tools, rosaries, tiny wooden crosses, the family Bible, if you were very lucky, were guarded with a fierceness that went beyond belief. They were anchors. Reminders that something bigger held the world together, even when everything else fell apart. In a world without abundance, tools were extensions of self. A reflection of your skill, your patience, your pride. And they were shared only when truly needed. A neighbor might ask for your axe not lightly but because theirs had shattered. And when you lent it, you weren't just lending wood and iron, you were offering trust. Bring it back. I will. And they did. Because breaking a promise around a tool wasn't just rude. It was dangerous. Tools kept you alive. Misuse them and you didn't just lose metal, you risked injury, hunger, failure. Which is why, even in trade, peasants knew the worth of tools better than silver. A fine blade was worth more than a bag of coins. A good rope, real hemp, tight twisted, might be bartered for chickens. A new pot, still unblackened, might be reserved months in advance. Because tools were not about wealth. They were about use. About function. About lasting through another season. And some tools were invisible. The calloused hands that wove baskets without thinking. The rhythmic memory of how to lay stones so they didn't shift with frost. The quiet skill of knowing which herbs soothed burns and which made you sleep. These were passed down too, not in leather or iron but in gestures, in repetitions, in soft lessons murmured by firelight. Watch. Do it like this. Good. Again. Until one day the child didn't need showing anymore. And they weren't just using the tool, they were the tool. A living extension of generations. Of hands that came before. Of voices that said, without ever saying it, "This is how we survive." And so, in every peasant home, beneath the smoke-blackened rafters and the soot-streaked walls, lay a quiet arsenal, not of weapons but of wisdom. Shaped into iron and wood. Worn into handles. Echoed in muscle. Not glamorous. Not modern. But sacred nonetheless. Because when the winter returned, or the harvest failed, or the roof leaked again, it was not wealth that saved them. It was the same tools. The same hands. The same knowing. And the same whispered promise passed from father to son, mother to daughter. If you care for it, it will care for you. Time for medieval peasants didn't tick. It turned. There were no wristwatches, no ticking clocks, No glowing screens to show how much of the day was left or how long until the next began. Time moved in shadows, seasons, and sounds, and no one was in a rush to keep track. They didn't need to. Their bodies already knew. A rooster crowing meant morning. The sun rising behind the eastern hills meant it was time to start. The length of your shadow across the field meant you should eat. The cooling of the wind told you the day was closing. The bells from the chapel marked not the hour, but the sacredness of stopping. Time wasn't about numbers. It was about noticing. The length of the day mattered more than the minute. The angle of the sun more than the second. The smell of the earth told more truth than any calendar. And peasants were experts in noticing. They noticed the dew drying from the grass a little faster than the day before. They noticed the way the hens laid earlier in the spring. They noticed how the sheep stood closer to the hedge before a storm. They noticed because they had to. The rhythm of their world was not mechanical. It was natural. Everything followed the turning of the earth. The beat of hooves. The creak of leather. The soft fall of rain. The pause before planting. The burst of harvest. The silence of winter. Their year wasn't marked by holidays but by the land. Plowing season in spring. Sowing time soon after. Haymaking when the grass grew high. Harvest when the barley bent low and golden. Threshing through the first weeks of autumn. And stillness when the frost arrived. Every task had its time. Every time had its purpose. And yet, it wasn't rigid. Time for peasants was elastic. It stretched or snapped depending on need. If you had to finish before the storm came, the day was short, even if the sun still burned in the sky. If you were mending a broken gate and it had to hold against the wind, then you stayed until it was done, no matter the hour. They didn't ask, "What time is it?" They asked, "Is it time yet?" And if it wasn't, they waited. Because patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. The grain wouldn't grow faster because you stared at it. The cow wouldn't give birth sooner because you were anxious. The snow wouldn't melt because you were ready for it to. So they learned to move with time, not chase it. To flow, not fight. Even their weeks moved differently. Yes, there were days of the week, at least by name. The church taught them, Sunday the day of rest, Friday for fish, feast days for saints. But for many peasants those names meant little. What mattered was what needed doing. There was bread day, and washing day, and mending day, and the day the pigs were slaughtered, and the day the priest came through, and the day you finally caught up on sleep, if you were lucky. And over time, those days became their own kind of calendar. I'll see you after wash day. Wait until the pig's blood is dried. Come find me when the moon is full again. The moon? Ah yes, the moon was their clock in the sky. They didn't read it. They felt it. The way it lit the field for nighttime work. The way it tugged at tides and tempers. The way its fullness meant time had passed. Some women marked their own rhythms by it. Silent knowledge passed from mother to daughter, not written but understood. And some men swore their dreams changed with it, growing stranger and louder as the moon swelled and dimmed. Even the animals followed time. Chickens roost without being told. Dogs stirred before dawn. Cows shifted in the dark, lowing softly before their owners even stood. Everyone knew, the world woke up together. And the day didn't start with an alarm. It started when the first sound broke the silence. Maybe the crow of a rooster. Or the creak of the barn door. Or the low murmur of someone stoking the fire before sunrise. That sound, whatever it was the day's beginning. And from there time flowed. In the field they marked time not by hours but by progress. We've done the western row. We're halfway to the stone wall. Let's stop when we reach the oak. It was distance, not duration, that measured labor. And when you stopped for food you didn't check the time, you felt the hunger. That deep, quiet pull in the stomach that said, "You've worked enough to earn this." Meals were not scheduled. They were taken when the body said please. And when night came it didn't come all at once. It seeped in. First the shadows lengthened. Then the chill set in. Then the birds grew quiet. Then the orange glow from the fire seemed to reach farther across the walls. That was the sign. You didn't say, "It's 9 p.m. You said, "It's time to bring the sheep in." Or, "It's getting dark. Light the lamp." Or, "I can't see the thread anymore." That's enough for tonight. And sleep? Sleep was not measured in hours. It was measured in cycles. You slept when you were tired. You woke when you were rested or needed, or cold, or nudged by a child whispering that something felt wrong. Some slept in 2 phases. A first sleep, then a waking, then a second sleep. The night broken in the middle by dreams, by prayers, by quiet thoughts in the dark. Some nights were interrupted by weather, or by birth, or by worry. And no one complained, because time belonged to the day, not the clock. In the village, the church bell was the closest thing to a clock tower. But it didn't tell time like we think of it. It told purpose. When the bell rang in the morning, it was time to pray. When it rang at noon, it was time to pause. When it rang at sundown, it was time to return. It didn't divide the day. It blessed it. And the peasants listened, not just with their ears but with their lives. Even the seasons moved differently for them. They didn't think in months. They thought in tasks. Spring was planting. Summer was tending. Autumn was harvesting. Winter was waiting. And within each season were more rhythms. The wild garlic came before the sheep shearing. The wheat ripened just after the roses bloomed. The rivers swelled after the first thunder. Time was not a line, it was a loop. Each year folded into the next. And the old people, the ones with wrinkled hands and quiet eyes, didn't talk about years past in numbers. They said things like, "That was the year the frost came early. That was the spring we lost the mare. That was the summer the bees left the hive." Time was not a chart, it was a story. And in that story, peasants were not the authors. They were the listeners, the characters, the ones who turned the page when the wind blew and did their best to keep up with the plot. They knew that time couldn't be kept, only witnessed, felt, respected. And in that simplicity there was a kind of peace. Because when you live by the land, you don't need to control time. You need only to move with it. To wake when the world wakes. To rest when the world rests. To remember that everything, sunrise, moonlight, harvest, frost, has its moment. And if you listen closely, the land will tell you when. In the medieval village, growing old wasn't a goal. It was a gift, one earned by surviving. If you reached old age, it meant you had already walked through more winters than many would ever see. You had survived fevers, famine, childbirth, bad harvests, falling off ladders and lifting too much. And so you weren't pitted, you were respected. Even if your back bent and your hands trembled. Even if your voice quavered and your memory faded. Even if you couldn't swing an axe or carry a bundle of hay anymore. You had already done all those things. And people remembered. Age in the village wasn't marked by birthdays. Most peasants didn't know the date they were born. They knew they were born the year of the red moon, or when the great frost killed the barley, or after old and died in childbirth. It didn't matter how old you were in numbers. What mattered was what you had seen, what you knew, what you could teach. Children knew who the elders were. Not because they were the loudest, but because they were often the quietest. Sitting near the fire, watching more than talking. Listening. Remembering. The old didn't chase attention. They didn't compete. They had nothing left to prove. They sat with their hands folded, or slowly sewing, or carefully sharpening a small tool with fingers that moved more from memory than strength. They might speak only when asked. Or they might break into story in the middle of the day, eyes lit not with urgency, but with the calm that comes from seeing patterns long enough to know when to share. Their stories weren't like books. They were woven. A little about the harvest. A little about a lost love. A little about a neighbor who once got stuck in the well. A little about the child who grew up to be a priest. Sometimes the lesson was hidden deep inside the tale. Sometimes the tale was the lesson itself. And children listened. Even if they squirmed. Even if they laughed at the funny parts. Even if they didn't understand everything. Because stories from the old weren't just entertainment. They were inheritance. A kind that didn't rust or rot. Wisdom in words, not coins. And in between those words there was guidance. Don't plant before the frogs croak. Always sleep with your feet toward the fire, never your head. If the dog growls at nothing, it's not nothing. Advice both practical and mystical. Superstitions passed down not from fear, but from observation. Because the old had seen things. Remembered things. Lived through things. They knew when to trust the sky. when to fear silence, when to pray harder than usual. But aging wasn't just about sitting and telling. Most elders still worked just differently. They mended clothes. They dried herbs. They rocked babies. They taught songs. They stirred the soup while others fetched water. They watched the fire so it didn't die. Their bodies slowed. But their presence was constant. And that presence brought peace. Children who woke from nightmares sought out grandmothers. Young women unsure about pregnancy leaned against old women who had given birth in barns and by riverbanks. Young men, wild with pride and temper, listened when an elder simply said, "That won't end well." The old didn't argue. They didn't shout. They just existed, solid and steady. Sometimes that was enough to shift a mood. And so aging wasn't feared. It was integrated. There were no retirement parties. No announcements that someone was now elderly. It happened slowly, naturally. You stopped going to the far field. You stopped rising with the oxen. You stopped lifting sacks taller than your knees. And no one blamed you. No one mocked. No one said, "You're too old now." They just noticed and adapted. You did less of some things, more of others. You helped with knowledge. You helped with patience. You helped by simply being there. And when you couldn't help anymore, when you were truly frail, then they helped you. Someone brought your bread. Someone rubbed your knees with tallow. Someone made sure you had the warmest corner near the fire. Someone offered their lap for your head when you dozed. It was never said aloud. It didn't need to be. Because once you had done the same for others. Aging wasn't about decay. It was about exchange. Giving what you had, receiving what you needed. And when death came, and it always did, it wasn't a stranger. It was expected. No. An old woman who stopped speaking. An old man who didn't wake after a nap. An elder who simply said, "I'm tired," and meant it. There was no panic. Only quiet. And if you had lived long and kind, you were mourned with warmth. People spoke your name around the fire for weeks. Someone might find your spindle still resting near the hearth and say, "She was halfway through that wool." A child might pick up your spoon and try to stir as you did. The memory stayed, not in stone but in habit. And if you were very lucky, if your stories were strong enough, if your love had run deep enough, you became a kind of legend. Grandfather said. Remember what old Dan used to say? She always knew when it would rain. And so you lived on. In actions. In rhythms. In whispers. And little things passed from hand to hand. And what of the young? They weren't eager to grow old. But they didn't fear it. They saw it every day up close. They saw that age didn't mean isolation. Didn't mean being forgotten. Didn't mean uselessness. They saw that age was layered. You could still laugh at 70. Still cry at 80. Still teach at 90. Still hum a lullaby on your final day. Because aging wasn't a decline. It was a deepening. A ripening. A slowing down, yes, but also a widening. A chance to see the whole picture, not just your corner. And so, in a village of peasants, age was a mirror. A child looking at an elder saw their future. And the elder looking at the child saw their past. And in that gaze, something unspoken passed between them. A promise. I'll become you. And I was once you. And that was enough. That was everything. To a medieval peasant, death was not a surprise. It was not far off. It was not spoken of in hushed tones, hidden behind curtains, or feared as an intruder. It was a companion. Always near. Always watching. Always walking just a few steps behind. They did not obsess over it. But neither did they pretend it wouldn't come. They had seen it too many times. In the lamb that didn't survive the cold. In the child who coughed too long in winter. In the mother who bled too much bringing new life. In the man who fell from the roof and never woke up. In the plague that came one year and took half the village in a week. Death wasn't rare. But neither was it the end of everything. It was simply the next thing. And in a way, peasants prepared for it every day, not with wills or lawyers or funeral plans, but with how they lived. Because legacy wasn't written in ink. It was carved in calluses, sewn into seams, planted in fields, sung in lullabies, and whispered into the ears of grandchildren who never met you, but somehow knew your name. A peasant's legacy began long before they died. It began in how they treated their neighbors, in the way they taught their children to hold a blade, in the way they helped patch a roof before a storm, in the way they listened when someone had no one else, in the way they laughed even when the crops failed. Their life was a pattern stitched one day at a time. And others noticed. Others remembered. She always shared her bread. He never raised his voice, not even when the ox broke the fence. That old man once carried me home when I was too little to walk. No gravestone could say it better. And when the time finally came, when a peasant felt the long pull of the end, they didn't panic. They noticed. The slowing. The quieting. The way their bones felt heavier. The way their thoughts turned backward more than forward. They might say something like, "The fields don't need me this year," or, "The cold doesn't bother me now." Or they might not say anything at all. Just a long sigh. A longer sleep. A last smile. Sometimes they died surrounded. Sometimes alone. Sometimes in pain. Sometimes in peace. But always remembered. Because the village knew how to carry grief. They didn't dress in black. They didn't shut the world out. They gathered. They spoke softly. They wept without shame. They brought food. They told stories. They lit candles. They sat beside the body. They prayed. They remembered. Children were not kept away. They were held close. Shown gently. Told honestly. His heart stopped working. She's with the saints now. She's gone to rest. And they understood, not in words but in rhythm. Because they had seen it before. And they would see it again. And one day it would be them. So they honored the dead. By finishing their weaving. By using their tools. By singing their songs. By planting in the soil they once tilled. By sleeping in the room they once warmed. By carrying forward not their sorrow, but their story. And in this way peasants achieved a kind of immortality. Not in monuments. Not in books. But in lives lived after them. In how someone tied their shoes the same way. In how bread was cut at an angle just so. In the way a child wrinkled their nose and someone said, "Just like her mother." Despite the isolation, despite the walls that kept the frost at bay and the days that passed in smoke and silence, peasants didn't face winter entirely alone. There were moments, brief, warm and flickering like candlelight, when the wider community stirred, gathered, and reminded itself that it was still a village. You couldn't visit neighbors often in winter. The roads were bad, the wind was worse, and your boots, if you had them, usually leaked. But when you did go, when you trudged through snowdrifts or followed paths beaten hard by livestock hooves, there was purpose in every step. Maybe someone had a new baby. Maybe someone was dying. Maybe the priest had news, or the miller had grain to share, or the blacksmith's son was finally marrying the shepherd's daughter after 3 winters of awkward glances over the firewood pile. These things mattered. Because in the long dark of the season, every shared moment felt larger. Every gathering was a fire against the cold. And the biggest of these moments? The feast. You wouldn't think, perhaps, that winter was a time for feasting. And mostly it wasn't. But precisely because food was scarce and time was slow, the rare feast day, whether religious or seasonal, was a big deal. Something to plan for, to whisper about, to hope would come soon enough to lift spirits before the next frost claimed another pig. The church calendar gave rhythm to the year. Even in peasant huts where no one could read, the stories and saints marched onward, giving structure to the formless gray weeks. And with those stories came feast days, holy days of celebration, where even the poorest villagers might dress in their second-best tunic and eat a little better than usual. Christmas, for instance. Not the bright, blinking holiday we know today, but a quiet, sacred time. A day of birth in the dead of winter. A day when the church was colder than the barn but filled with singing voices. People gathered, brought what they could, shared bread and broth, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of roasted meat if someone had slaughtered early. There were 12 days of Christmas, not one. And for those dozen days the village shifted. There was dancing in barns. Plays in the churchyard. Mummers in masks reciting half-remembered legends. Gifts were rare and humble, a carved spoon, a handful of dried fruit, but treasured all the more. Then came Candlemas in February, to bless the candles for the year and mark the midpoint to spring. A glimmer of hope. A flickering reminder that light would return. Some years there'd be a procession. Other years only the memory of one. There were local festivals too, linked to saints or harvests or even old pagan echoes that the church had halfway adopted and the people had never quite forgotten. Days when the ale flowed, the dancing got rowdy, and someone inevitably passed out in the hay. But these moments didn't just happen. They were earned. Feasts were rare because they came at a cost. You couldn't have a feast without taking from your stores. That chicken you were saving? It might become stew for 12. That cheese aging quietly in the corner? Sliced and shared. That secret hoard of apples from October? Baked, spiced, and gone before nightfall. It wasn't reckless. It was intentional. Because sharing wasn't wasteful. It was human. A declaration, we may not have much, but we have each other. And if feasts were the highs, fasts were the balance. There were seasons of restraint, Advent, Lent, and every Friday without meat. Not because food was always abundant, but because the church said so, and because saying no made the yes sweeter. On fasting days you made do with fish if you had it, or with grains or roots or plain bread. Sometimes it wasn't much different from every other day, but the intention mattered. It created rhythm, gave shape to the shapelessness. Fasting, like feasting, reminded people that the body wasn't the only thing that needed feeding. And then there were the small gatherings. The quiet ones. A visit from the neighbor down the lane. A shared mending circle by the fire, where women brought torn cloaks and gossip in equal measure. A barn raising in snow, because the animals didn't care what month it was if their roof was leaking. A birth. A burial. A blessing. In those moments the village became a lifeline. Maybe you brought broth to the sick. Maybe you took in someone else's child when their mother couldn't get out of bed. Maybe you lent your last candle stub to someone whose home had gone dark. Not because you expected it back. Because one day you'd need the same. Peasants knew the truth. Winter didn't take everyone equally. Some years one family lost a cow. Another lost a roof. Another lost a child. And the only way forward was together. No one said it out loud usually. No one made speeches. They just showed up. With bread. With wood. With time. Children saw this and learned. They saw their father walk through snow to help dig out the neighbor's well. Saw their mother boil an extra pot of broth for the widow down the road. Saw their uncle carry a sack of grain not to sell, but to give. And they learned what community meant, not just shared space but shared survival. In spring, when the snow melted and the fields softened and the air smelled less like ash and more like promise, the community came back to life in new ways. But in winter, those deep, quiet moments of togetherness had already done the work. They had held each other in the dark. Shared the song when the wind howled. Lent laughter when there was no reason. Told stories that reminded them they were not alone. They might not have had much, but they had each other. And in winter that was everything. Would you like to continue to section 12 next? It will explore how peasants dealt with death in winter, rituals, grief, and the quiet ways people were remembered even in the coldest seasons. Just say next. You said. Next 1,500 words not short. ChatGPT said. Here is section 12, 1,500 words, in full length and detail, continuing our immersive, sleep-style story. This section explores how medieval peasants dealt with death in winter, from the physical hardships of burial in frozen ground to the quiet rituals, grieving, and memories passed down in candlelit whispers. Death was never far in a medieval village. But in winter it came closer, colder, quieter, with less warning and less mercy. It came not as a thunderclap but a slow fading, a cough that grew into silence, a fever that didn't break, a fall on ice that never quite healed. People didn't expect to live long lives. Many didn't reach adulthood. But still, when death arrived, even in its commonness, it hurt. And in the coldest months that hurt deepened. Because death in winter was not only emotional, it was logistical. It was physical labor. It was frostbitten hands and iron-hard earth. It was grief made harder by the frozen ground. When someone passed, the house fell silent. Not just out of respect but necessity. Grieving took energy. And in winter, energy was a resource as tightly rationed as grain. First came the preparation of the body. Not in fine robes, not with perfumes and ceremonies, but with reverence all the same. The dead were washed, gently, with whatever water could be warmed without robbing the fire of its heat. Fingers were straightened. Eyes closed. A cross might be drawn on the forehead. A candle might be lit nearby, flickering in the drafty room as if to mark the presence of something sacred that lingered just a little longer. Legacy wasn't grand. It was woven. It lingered in the smoke above the hearth. In the creak of the floorboards. In the path worn from the door to the well. In the laughter that still echoed when someone told a very old joke. And though they had little, no gold, no land of their own, no titles, they left behind the only thing that truly mattered. Memory. Alive. Gentle. Persistent. like the roots of a tree long cut down, still holding the earth in place. So when you think of those peasants, long gone, names forgotten, bones now part of the soil, know this: they did not vanish. They became the world they left behind. Every barn beam blackened by smoke. Every song passed down. Every stubborn seed that grew because they didn't give up. They are there. Still working. Still singing. Still watching. And maybe, just maybe, when the wind brushes your cheek on a cold night, or when a fire crackles just right, or when your hands remember how to do something without thinking, that's them. Whispering, "You're doing fine." Life in a medieval village was hard. That much was certain. Days began before dawn and ended only when the fire flickered low, and even then, sleep was a short reprieve before it all began again. And yet, amid the toil and mud and worry, there were glimmers, brief, brilliant glimmers, of joy. Because joy, for peasants, wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. A kind of rebellion against the heaviness of life. And they took it wherever they could find it. They didn't wait for the perfect moment. They didn't plan celebrations with precision. Joy arrived in small surprises: the taste of honey after weeks of plain porridge, the warmth of a shared joke by the fire, the comfort of a familiar song hummed while sweeping the floor. Peasants didn't need much to feel rich. A roasted onion, a mug of ale, a child's laugh. These were treasures that lit up the dark corners of ordinary days. Sometimes the church gave them a reason to stop. Feast days honoring saints brought a brief break in the rhythm. Not a full day off. Life rarely allowed such indulgence, but a morning to rise slowly or an afternoon to linger at the table. On these days people cooked a little more generously. Perhaps someone added herbs to the stew or baked something sweet with nuts gathered weeks before. It was never about extravagance. It was about the shift in feeling. Today is not like the others. These days were shared, not hoarded. Villagers gathered in the open, near the church, beside the well, under the ancient tree by the mill. Children darted between legs, women swapped stories, and men drank slowly, their boots muddy but their spirits high. Someone always brought an instrument, even if it was just spoons tapped together or a hollow log beaten like a drum. Music didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be alive. And then there was dancing. Joyful, clumsy, chaotic dancing. Not for performance but for release. Girls twirled until they collapsed giggling. Old men stomped and waved their arms with the wildness of youth. Mothers spun in circles with babies on their hips. There were no steps to follow, no shame in stumbling. You danced not because you were good at it but because your soul insisted. The body moved and the heart followed. Laughter flowed just as freely. Sometimes soft and knowing, other times loud enough to startle the chickens. It came when the cow escaped again, or when the priest forgot the words mid-sermon. It bubbled up during the retelling of old mishaps, the time someone fell into the pond chasing a goose, or when old Marta baked salt instead of sugar into the feast day cakes. These stories weren't told to mock but to remember, and to celebrate the beautiful absurdity of living. Weddings were another kind of celebration entirely. When two people wed, the village didn't just attend. They erupted. Tables were dragged into the yard, bread was broken, ale flowed, and songs filled the air. The newlyweds were carried through the streets on shoulders, kissed by everyone, blessed by grandmothers, and chased by giggling children. It didn't matter how simple the clothes were or how meager the food. What mattered was the feeling. This is a new beginning and we're all part of it. Even small things were celebrated. A child's first step. A daughter's first time weaving alone. A son's first time lifting the hay fork without help. These moments were met with pride, not paraded, but honored. A nod. A squeeze of the hand. A bowl of something sweet quietly placed beside them. Peasants also knew the joy of quiet moments. A perfectly browned loaf pulled from the oven. The feel of the sun on their back after a week of rain. A hot stone placed at the foot of the bed on a freezing night. The way smoke curled just right above the chimney, or how the stars peeked out clearly on a moonless evening. No song was sung but inside the heart swelled just the same. Their joy was not performative. It was intimate. It existed in glances, in silences, in the sheer gratitude of being together. In knowing that, despite the weight of the world, someone had saved the last bit of bread for you. That someone had carried extra firewood without being asked. That someone had remembered your favorite way to stir the pot. Even grief didn't erase joy, it deepened it. After a loss, the first laugh in a household felt sacred. A signal that life, stubborn and soft, would go on. That love, once lost, still echoed in the stories, still warmed the air like the last embers of a long-burning fire. Their joy had nothing to do with wealth. It came from knowing that you had enough. Not more, not best, just enough. Enough food to share. Enough time to dance. Enough warmth to sit a little closer. Enough love to keep going. In truth, joy was never separate from hardship. It existed because of it. They danced because they had worked. They sang because they had wept. They feasted because they had known hunger. The harder the season, the deeper the gratitude for its passing. In the end, joy for peasants was a thread woven tightly through the fabric of their lives. It held everything together, the losses, the labor, the love. It shimmered in the places you'd least expect, like gold in a muddy stream. And when life asked everything of them, joy gave them back a little more. So now, at the quiet edge of this long telling, let's rest. You've walked through their fields. You've knelt by their fires. You've felt their cold nights and warm bread, heard their laughter echo through wooden walls, and seen their shadows lengthen under the turning skies. The medieval peasant, poor by coin, rich by memory. A life often buried beneath history books and royal names. But still here, still breathing, in the soil, in the stories, in the silence between things. You felt what they felt, not as a historian but as a guest. And if you listened closely, with your heart rather than your mind, maybe you heard something you didn't expect. A kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of scholars. Not the pride of noble courts. But the quiet kind. The kind you learn with your hands in the earth. With your ear against the wind. With your life woven so tightly with others that you don't remember where you end and they begin. That kind of wisdom can't be taught. It must be lived. It begins with knowing that the world is bigger than you. That the sky will not change just because you wish it to. That the rain falls where it may. That life comes and goes in cycles. And that survival in the end is not a solitary act, but a collective song. In the peasant's world, every person was a note. Every task a rhythm. Every story a refrain. The rhythm of sweeping straw. Of sharpening a blade. Of folding dough. Of rocking a baby. Of shivering under wool and still offering a smile. That's the song they sang, not with instruments but with living itself. No verse was perfect. No melody was smooth. But it was honest, and oh how it carried. They knew joy was fleeting, and so they seized it. They knew grief was certain, and so they shared it. They knew time could not be tamed, and so they moved with it, not against it. They did not chase legacy. They did not carve their names in stone. They carved them in people. In kindness. In patience. In the way they loved their children. In the way they remembered the names of the dead. In the way they folded laundry the same way their mother did. In the way they laughed when it rained on the hay. And though they lived without luxury, they lived with presence. They felt the cold. They watched the seasons. They breathed deeply because no one told them not to. They worked slowly when they could. They sat in silence not because it was awkward but because it was enough. They didn't need to fill the air. They didn't need to always be doing. Sometimes they simply were. And in that stillness they found a kind of peace. A peace that came from knowing exactly who they were, and exactly what mattered. Not ambition. Not acquisition. But connection. To the land. To the people. To the day. To the sacred rhythm of doing what needed to be done. No more, no less. It was not always easy. In fact, it rarely was. But it was real. And because it was real, it endured. You see, their homes are long gone. Their boots, their spoons, their spinning wheels, all vanished. But their way of being? That stayed. In every gardener who knows when to plant by feel. In every neighbor who brings bread without being asked. In every parent who hums the same lullaby they once heard as a child. In every elder who sits quietly and watches the fire, not needing to say a word. The peasant lives in you too. In your breath. In your rest. In your longing for simpler things. In your ache for belonging. In your yearning for a life where meaning isn't purchased, but practiced. That's what they knew. And that's what they offer now as you lay down, perhaps in a soft bed they never imagined, with the hum of machines they never dreamed of, and yet still, the same stars outside your window. Stars they knew. The same moon that watched them gather firewood now watches you fall asleep. It does not ask for attention. It does not blink. It simply is. And so, tonight let yourself be. Not for anyone else. Not for anything to prove. Just be. Like they did. Let go of the need to do. To fix. To plan. To solve. You've done enough. More than enough. Let the fire crackle in your memory. Let the bread rise in your chest. Let the laughter echo down the hall of time. Let the soft creak of a wooden door close behind you as you settle in. You are safe. You are warm. You are part of something bigger, something ancient and human and good. Sleep now not as an escape but as a homecoming, a return to the deep rhythm, to the field, to the fire, to the people who walked before you, and the peace they knew. Sleep like the peasant, without hurry, without worry, and with the deep understanding that tomorrow will come, and you will meet it not with fear, but with hands open and heart steady. Close your eyes. Breathe with the rhythm of the earth. You are not alone. They are still here, whispering in the wind, waiting in the soil, humming softly in the dark. You've done well. Rest now. Everything is taken care of. Good night.